She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply left and took everything. The night Damien Cross walked through his front door smelling like another woman's perfume, he expected dinner on the table and silence in the halls. What he found instead was an empty mansion, a wedding ring on the floor, and a sealed envelope that would end his life as he knew it. No warning, no argument, just absence, cold, surgical, and absolute. If you've ever underestimated someone who loved you quietly, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The elevator doors of the Meridian Tower opened at 2:47 in the morning, and Damien Cross stepped out into the private lobby of the penthouse floor wearing a smile that hadn't earned itself. He adjusted his cufflinks in the reflection of the marble wall. Italian marble, $38 per square foot. The kind of detail he mentioned at dinner parties because it made people go quiet. He liked that. He liked the quiet that came from money. He smelled like Celeste. Not her perfume exactly. She wore something French, something that cost more per ounce than most people's grocery bills. No, he smelled like the particular warmth of her apartment, her sheets, the residue of a night spent in a place where nobody asked anything of him. He had been seeing Celeste Fairmore for 14 months. He wasn't hiding it. He simply wasn't announcing it either, and in Damien's world, that distinction mattered. His key slid into the lock, and the door swung open without resistance. The lights were off. That was the first thing wrong. Isla always left the kitchen light on. She had done it since the second month they lived together. Some old habit she'd carried from childhood that she'd never explained and he'd never bothered to ask about. 7 years of marriage and that kitchen light had been burning every time he came home late. Tonight, it wasn't. He stepped inside and reached for the wall panel. When the foyer illuminated, the wrongness of everything landed on him at once. Not gradually, but all at once, like a trapdoor opening beneath his feet. The paintings were gone. The large abstract canvas his firm had purchased at a Sotheby's auction. Gone. The console table where Isla kept a ceramic bowl for keys. Gone. The photographs that lined the hallway leading to the sitting room. Every single one of them. Gone. The walls were bare. The spaces where things had been were marked only by faint rectangular shadows on the paint, like outlines at a crime scene. Damien moved deeper into the apartment. His footsteps sounded different, louder, the kind of echo that only comes from rooms that have lost their furniture. He pushed open the sitting room door. Empty. The $8,000 sectional, the custom bookshelves Isla had designed herself, the reading lamp she'd ordered 3 times before getting the right one. All of it, gone. He stood in the center of the room, breathing through his nose, trying to make the space make sense, and it wouldn't. He walked to the bedroom. Her closet was open. He already knew what he'd find before he got there. The hanging rods were bare. The shelves were cleared, not ransacked. There was no violence in it, no mess, no overturned boxes or scattered shoes. She had packed methodically. She had planned. Every single piece of clothing, every bag, every shoe, every item had been removed with a patience that was worse than fury. On the bed, their bed, though he hadn't slept in it 3 nights running, there was a sealed envelope and a wedding ring. His hands were steadier than they should have been when he picked up the envelope. He told himself it was because he was calm. It wasn't calm. It was the stillness that comes just before the mind accepts something it already knows. He opened it. The note was handwritten. Isla had elegant handwriting. Small, controlled, slanted slightly to the left. He'd always noticed it without ever saying so. It said, "By sunrise, nothing in this house belongs to you. Not the walls, not the address, not the years. I am not leaving because I am broken. I am leaving because I finally understand that I never have to explain myself to you again." No name, no signature. She hadn't needed one. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the bare mattress and sat beside it, and for a long moment he didn't think anything at all. His mind had that flat, white quality of a television that's been switched off, just static, just nothing. Then the knock came. It was sharp and unhurried, the knock of someone who had no anxiety about what waited on the other side. Damien crossed the empty apartment and opened the front door, and standing in the hallway under the corridor lights was Gavin Mercer. He hadn't changed much. 6 years had maybe put some silver at his temples and a steadiness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But he was still recognizably himself. the same quiet posture, the same economy of movement. He was wearing a dark coat, and he wasn't smiling. "Damien," he said. That was all. Just the name, like a period at the end of a sentence. Damien's jaw tightened. Of all the things that could have appeared on the other side of that door, lawyers, journalists, police, Gavin Mercer was the one he would have least predicted and most feared seeing. The man he had dismantled. The company he had swallowed whole during a hostile acquisition 6 years ago, using tactics that lived in the gray zone of legality and the black zone of decency. He had walked away from that deal with a significant portfolio increase and no consequences. Gavin had walked away with nothing. "What are you doing in my building?" Damien said. It wasn't a question. "Your building." Gavin tilted his head slightly. "Technically, as of 8 hours ago, it's not your building." A silence passed between them that had weight and temperature. "The penthouse was sold this afternoon," Gavin continued. "Sale went through at 4:52 p.m. Proper documentation, legal transfer. Your wife had full ownership rights on the property. Her name was the primary on the deed. Did you know that?" He paused. "I'm guessing you didn't." Damien's stomach dropped, but his face didn't change. He was good at that. He had spent 20 years perfecting the stillness of his expression, learning to wear it the way other men wore armor. "Who bought it?" he said. "I did." The two words landed like stones in still water, and the ripples went outward and didn't stop. Damien stepped back. Not far, just enough. "You're telling me my wife sold our home to you?" "She sold it to me at market value. Every cent went into accounts I don't have access to and you won't find." Gavin wasn't gloating. That was the thing that unsettled Damien most. There was no heat in it. The man spoke the way someone speaks when they are delivering facts they have had a long time to make peace with. "She reached out to me 8 months ago. Said she needed someone who understood what you were capable of and wasn't afraid of you. Took me about 30 seconds to say yes." Damien's fingers curled at his sides. "Isla doesn't know anything about business." Gavin looked at him for a moment. "That's what you think?" And that look, not contemptuous, not triumphant, just quietly certain, was the most terrifying thing Damien had seen in years. He slammed the door. His palms were sweating. He crossed to the window and looked out at Manhattan, 32 floors below. The city still burning with light at nearly 3 in the morning because it never stopped. It never rested. It never let you breathe without reminding you it could take you apart. He had always looked at this view and felt ownership. Tonight it looked back at him and felt like nothing he knew. He pulled out his phone and called Isla. Straight to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He typed a message. "We need to talk. This is not how we handle things. Call me back." And watched the delivery confirmation sit there without a read receipt. He called his attorney. The call went to his assistant's voicemail because it was 3 in the morning and reasonable people were asleep. He called his CFO and got the same. He stood in the empty apartment of his former life holding a phone that had suddenly become a very expensive piece of useless glass. He thought about calling Celeste. He didn't. Some small, surviving piece of his dignity stopped him from making that particular call. Because Celeste would answer. She always answered. But he knew with the cold clarity of a man who has just begun to understand the depth of his mistakes that Celeste was never the refuge he had told himself she was. She was a distraction, a habit, a way of walking through his own life without ever having to look at it. He sat on the floor of the empty sitting room with his back against the wall because there was nowhere else to sit, and he tried to reconstruct the last 8 months. He tried to find the seam, the point where Isla had shifted from the woman who endured his absences without complaint to the woman who had just dismantled everything he owned with the quiet efficiency of a surgeon. He couldn't find it. That was the part that cut deepest. He had looked at her for 7 years and seen only what he needed her to be. Steady, patient, decorative in the ways that mattered at events, invisible in the ways that made his life convenient. He had never once thought to look closer. His father used to say that the most dangerous person in any room is the one nobody's watching. Damien had quoted that at a keynote address 3 years ago. He had meant it about himself. He had never once applied it to his wife. The sun came up slowly, the way New York mornings do in October, going from black to gray to a thin dishwater light that didn't warm anything. Damien hadn't slept. He had moved through the apartment cataloging what wasn't there, trying to identify if she'd left him anything of value, and finding almost nothing. His watches were gone from the dresser. The safe in the study, which he had believed only he knew the combination to, was open and empty. His personal laptop was gone. A collection of physical documents he had kept in a locked drawer, documents whose disappearance made him go very still for a very long time, were gone. She had the documents. The moment he understood what that meant, he sat down again, this time on the study floor, and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Those documents were not things Isla was supposed to have ever seen. They were not things anyone outside of 3 very specific people was supposed to know existed. They were the architecture of a financial life that his public life was designed to conceal. Account numbers in jurisdictions that asked no questions, wire records, correspondence that would require significant explanation if it ever reached the wrong eyes. He had kept them physical because he didn't trust servers. He had kept them locked because he trusted nobody. He had never imagined he needed to lock them against Isla because Isla had been, in his estimation, a woman who accepted the shape of her life without inspecting the structure underneath it. He had been wrong. He was still sitting there when his phone lit up with a message from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. It was a news alert, a screenshot forwarded from what appeared to be a financial publication's early morning digital edition. The headline read, "Cross Capital under investigation. Federal sources confirm preliminary inquiry into offshore holdings." He read it 3 times. The words didn't change. Below the forwarded screenshot was a single line of text from the unknown number. "The investigation began 6 weeks ago. You missed it because you weren't paying attention." He stared at that initial for a long time. Just the letter. Just that single, lowercase I. He had never once in 7 years thought of Isla as someone with an initial instead of a name. She had always been the whole word to him when he bothered to use it at all. But there was something about seeing just the letter, something economical, something pointed, something that communicated through the very smallness of it that she no longer needed to take up more space in his world than a single character, that made his chest tighten in a way he didn't have a word for. His attorney called at 8:15. The conversation was not long, and it was not good. Federal inquiry confirmed. Account freezes likely within 48 hours. The penthouse sale was airtight. His firm had already been contacted by investigators. His CFO, when reached, was apparently cooperating with the timeline of inquiries, which was a phrase that meant precisely what Damien feared it meant. He stood at the window watching the city come fully alive below him, watching cabs and commuters and delivery vans moving through the grid like blood through veins, all of it indifferent, all of it continuing without him, and understood for the first time in his adult life that he was not the most powerful person in his own story. That knowledge didn't arrive with thunder. It arrived the way a verdict does, quietly, with finality, with the specific weight of something that cannot be taken back. His phone rang again. The number on the screen belonged to a journalist he had given exactly 2 on-record interviews to in the last decade, a woman at the Times who covered financial crime with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the best stories weren't broken, they were assembled, piece by piece, over time. He let it ring. Then, because he had nowhere else to go and the apartment no longer belonged to him, and his accounts were hours away from being frozen, and the woman he had spent 7 years failing to see had just revealed herself to be the most formidable opponent he had ever faced, Damien Cross did something he hadn't done since he was 23 years old and broke and standing at the beginning of everything. He didn't know what to do next. The silence of the empty apartment pressed in from every wall. His reflection in the darkened window, that polished, expensive, untouchable man, looked back at him like a stranger. And somewhere across this city, Isla was awake. She had been awake for this. She had planned for this. She had looked at everything he was and decided, without anger, without theater, without a single moment of visible weakness, that none of it was worth staying for. And the thing he could not stop thinking about, the thing that lodged itself beneath everything else and would not move, was not the accounts, not the investigation, not the penthouse, not even the documents she had taken. It was the kitchen light. 8 years. Every time he came home, no matter what hour, the kitchen light was on. He had never thanked her for it. He had never once thought about what it cost her to keep that small, foolish light burning for a man who barely noticed she was there. Tonight, it was off. And somehow, in the wreckage of everything Isla had just taken from him, that was the detail that made Damien Cross finally, fully understand that he had lost something he hadn't known he was holding. He reached for his phone again. Not to call his attorney, not to call his CFO, not to manage the disaster assembling itself around him at speed, but because something in him needed, desperately and for reasons he couldn't explain, to know where she was. The message he typed was not strategic. It was not calculated. It was the message of a man who has just felt the first cold touch of something like genuine fear. Not fear of consequences, but fear of something older and harder to name. "Where are you?" He sent it. The red receipt appeared almost immediately. She had read it. She did not reply. And in the quiet of that apartment that no longer belonged to him, with the Manhattan sunrise turning the windows gold, Damian Cross began to understand for the first time what it felt like to stand at the edge of a life you built with your own hands and watch it hold absolutely still while you fell. He just didn't know yet how far he still had left to fall. The read receipt sat there like an open wound. Damian stared at it for 40 seconds. He counted, without meaning to, the way you count things when your mind needs something small to hold on to. She had read it. The 2 gray check marks had gone blue at 8:51 in the morning, which meant she was awake, which meant she had a phone in her hand, which meant she had looked at his words and made the deliberate choice to say nothing back. He had never in 7 years felt the specific cruelty of being read and ignored by Isla Rowan. She had always answered. That had been the architecture of their dynamic. He spoke, she responded. He demanded, she accommodated. He disappeared for days. She was there when he returned. It had been so consistent, so reliable, that he had stopped registering it as a choice she made. He had filed it under the category of things that simply happened, like weather, like gravity, like the kitchen light. He threw the phone onto the bare mattress and stood up. He needed to think. He needed a shower, a suit, and a chair in a room where someone was telling him what to do next, because the feeling of not knowing what to do next was a sensation his body didn't know how to carry. He had not been uncertain since his 20s. He had engineered his entire life to eliminate uncertainty, and standing in an empty apartment that belonged to Gavin Mercer, wearing yesterday's clothes, with the smell of Celeste still on him, and his accounts 48 hours from freezing, uncertainty was the only thing left in the room. He went to the bathroom. His toiletries were still there. She hadn't touched those. He wasn't sure if that was mercy or contempt. He stood under the shower with the water too hot and his forehead against the tile and tried to build a sequence. Attorneys first, then the CFO, then PR, then the journalist at the Times, not to answer her questions but to understand how much he already knew and whether there was still a version of this story where he controlled the narrative. He dressed in the same shirt, smoothed the collar in the empty mirror frame. She had taken the mirror, he realized, not because it was valuable, but because its absence would be noticed, and walked out. Gavin Mercer was sitting in the lobby downstairs, not waiting in a threatening way, just sitting, one leg crossed, reading something on his phone with the specific patience of a man who has nowhere more important to be. He looked up when Damian stepped out of the elevator. "You sleep?" Gavin asked. "Move," Damian said. "You look like you didn't sleep." Damian stopped 6 feet from him. The lobby attendant, a young man named Teo, who had worked the morning shift for 3 years and who Damian had never once learned the name of, was watching from the desk with wide eyes and the careful stillness of someone calculating how quickly he could reach a phone. "I don't know what she told you," Damian said, keeping his voice low. "I don't know what kind of picture she painted, but you need to understand that you are involving yourself in a private matter between a husband and wife. And when this is over, and it will be over, you will have made an enemy you were not equipped to handle the first time around and are significantly less equipped to handle now." Gavin set his phone down on his knee. He didn't stand up. That deliberate choice to remain seated, to refuse to physically meet Damian at his level, was the kind of move that Damian himself had used in boardrooms for 20 years, and he recognized it with a fury that tasted like copper. "She told me the truth," Gavin said. "That's all. The whole thing, 7 years of it." He paused. "Took her about 4 hours. I didn't say much. I mostly just listened." Another pause. "When was the last time somebody did that for her?" Damian's jaw was tight enough to ache. "You don't know her." "I know she called me from a parking garage because she was afraid to make that call from inside her own home." Gavin's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I know she had a plan drawn up before she ever contacted me. I know she spent 3 months verifying every piece of information before she moved a single asset. She didn't need me, Damian. She needed someone to stand near the door while she finished packing." The lobby was quiet. Outside the glass doors, Manhattan was in full morning roar. Buses, construction, a courier on a bicycle threading between a cab and a delivery truck. All of it indifferent, all of it continuing. "Where is she?" Damien said. "Somewhere you're not." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting from me." Gavin finally stood. He wasn't a large man, an inch shorter than Damien, less broad through the shoulders, but he stood the way people stand when they have spent years learning not to flinch. "My attorney will be in contact with yours by noon. There are procedures. There are processes. You will follow them, or the additional information in our possession gets delivered to the federal team today instead of next week." Damien went still. "Additional information." "She documented everything, Damien. You understand what I mean by everything." Gavin picked up his phone and slid it into his coat pocket. 7 years of everything. He walked past Damien toward the elevator, and Damien didn't stop him, because stopping him would have required knowing what to say, and for the second time in 12 hours, the words weren't there. He walked out of the building into the October air and called his attorney from the sidewalk. Marcus Webb had been Damien's personal attorney for 11 years. He was 61 years old, had survived 3 recessions, 2 divorces, his own, and a disbarment threat in 2019 that had cost him 2 years of panic and 1 year of settlement negotiations. He was not easily rattled. When he answered on the second ring, the first thing he said was, "I've been waiting for this call since 6 a.m. "How bad?" Damien said. "Define bad." "Don't do that. Don't do the lawyer thing. Just tell me." A breath on the other end. "The federal inquiry is real. It's preliminary, but it's real. And it's not new. Whoever tipped them has been building this for months. Your offshore structures in the Caymans and in Luxembourg are specifically mentioned in the filing language I was able to access this morning. The account freeze is coming, probably Thursday. Your board has been notified." "My board?" Damien stopped walking. A woman in a gray coat bumped his shoulder without apologizing and kept moving. "Who notified my board?" "The inquiry notification went through standard channels, which means your general counsel received it, which means your board knows." Marcus paused. "Harlan Voss called me at 7. He's not happy." Harlan Voss was the chairman of Cross Capital's board, a 70-year-old man from Virginia who had the affect of someone's grandfather and the ethical flexibility of a traffic cone. Harlan's unhappiness was not a small thing. "I need to get ahead of this," Damien said. "You needed to get ahead of this 6 months ago." "Marcus, I'm telling you the truth because that's what you pay me for. Whatever is on those offshore accounts, whatever the documentation shows. If someone with access to that information has been building a case, we are behind. We are not slightly behind. We are significantly behind." Another pause. "Is there documentation outside the digital records? Anything physical that could have been accessed without your knowledge?" "The study floor. The open safe. The empty drawer." Damien said nothing. "Damien, there may have been physical records that were removed." The silence on the other end had a specific quality. "Removed by whom?" "My wife." The silence extended. Marcus was doing the calculation. Damien could hear it in the quality of the quiet. "Your wife," Marcus said finally, "has physical financial documentation." "Yes." "Documentation that pertains to the offshore structures." "Potentially." "And she has provided this, or will provide this, to the federal investigators." Damien closed his eyes. The October wind came off the Hudson from somewhere uptown and hit him in the face. "I don't know yet what she intends to do with it." "Then we need to find out. And we need to find out today, because if that documentation reaches the federal team before we have established a position..." Marcus stopped himself. "Where is she?" "I don't know." Another silence, shorter this time and sharper. "You don't know where your wife is?" "She left last night, took everything. I came home and the apartment was cleared out." He paused. "She sold the penthouse to a man named Gavin Mercer. The sale went through yesterday afternoon." "Gavin Mercer." Marcus said the name with the careful pronunciation of someone running it through their memory. "Cross Meridian Acquisition, 2018. "Yes." "The man whose company you..." "Yes." A long exhale. "Damien, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not contact your wife directly. Do not go to wherever she is. Do not send messages. Do not make calls. Do not have anyone make contact on your behalf outside of legal representation. Do you understand me? She's my wife. She is your wife who is in possession of federal evidence and who has demonstrated in the last 24 hours that she has been planning this moment for at minimum 6 to 8 months, with the assistance of a man who has significant personal motivation to see you destroyed. She is not the woman you think you married, or another pause. She is, and you never actually looked. Damien ended the call. He stood on the sidewalk with the city heaving around him and felt something move through his chest that wasn't anger and wasn't fear, but was something that lived between them, something animal, reactive, and not entirely in his control. He had always managed his emotions the way he managed his spreadsheets, contained, structured, accessible only when useful. The thing moving through him now didn't behave that way. It moved the way water moves when a dam cracks. Not all at once, not in a flood, but in that first terrifying trickle that means the structure has already failed. He took a cab to the Romer, a hotel in Midtown he used for business guests, where the staff knew him and the room would be held without questions. He checked in, went upstairs, ordered coffee and something he didn't eat, and sat at the desk in the window with his laptop open and began doing what he did best: building a picture. He went through every contact in his phone. He searched every shared account he still had access to. Most were already frozen or in the process of being transferred, but the email account connected to their joint calendar was still accessible. He went back 8 months in the shared calendar, looking for appointments, for gaps, for days she had marked as unavailable without explanation. He found 43 of them. 43 days and 8 months where Isla had blocked time with no description, no location, no indication of where she had been. He had never looked at the shared calendar except to add his own events. He had never once noticed her schedule, her patterns, the architecture of her days. 43 days, 8 months, 344 hours of planning, of meetings, of legal consultations and financial transfers and document preparation, and he had sat across from her at dinner, the few dinners they had shared, and seen nothing, noticed nothing, asked nothing, because he had never thought to. His coffee went cold. He didn't notice. He was still going through the calendar when his phone rang. Not Marcus, not his CFO. The number belonged to Celeste. He looked at it for 4 rings. He answered. "I've been calling since last night," she said immediately. Her voice had a high, thin quality that he hadn't heard before. "I saw the news this morning. The financial piece. What is happening?" "It's being handled," he said automatically. "That's not an answer, Damien." A sharpness in her voice now. "My name appears in 2 of your personal accounts as a secondary contact. If there is an investigation, your name is a secondary contact for notification purposes. It's administrative. That is not how investigators will read it." She was breathing fast. He could hear it. "I need to know if I need my own attorney." The question sat between them, and it changed something. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony, but permanently. He heard in that question the specific sound of a person calculating their own exposure, and he understood that Celeste Fairmore, who had been his companion and his escape and his primary excuse for 7 years, was not calling out of concern for him. "Get your own attorney," he said. "That's always good advice." "Damien, you should probably not call this number again for a while." He hung up. He sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of the hotel room and understood with a clarity that comes only from exhaustion and the removal of illusions that he was alone. Genuinely, structurally alone. His wife had left. His mistress was protecting herself. His board was circling. His accounts were freezing. His attorney's advice was essentially to go sit in a corner and make no sudden movements. He thought about Gavin Mercer's face in the lobby, the lack of heat in it, the patience. He opened his laptop and searched Gavin Mercer's name. The results were what he expected. Business coverage. The Cross Meridian acquisition from 2018, in which Damien's firm had executed a hostile takeover of Mercer's mid-sized logistics company, using a set of procedural maneuvers that had been technically legal and broadly understood by anyone paying attention to be predatory. Mercer had gone public with his objections at the time. A few interviews, a formal complaint that went nowhere, a piece in a trade publication that got moderate traction and then died. He had lost the company, the capital, and by most accounts several years of his professional momentum. But the more recent results were different. In the last 3 years, Gavin Mercer had rebuilt. Quietly, without fanfare, without the kind of public profile that attracts attention. A new firm, smaller but apparently solid. A reputation in certain financial circles for ethical practice. And, Damien leaned forward, a consulting relationship with 2 separate federal oversight bodies, one of them the same body currently running the preliminary inquiry into Cross Capital. He read that last line 3 times. Gavin Mercer wasn't just a man Isla had sold the apartment to. He wasn't just a convenient ally with personal grievance. He had spent 3 years building a position from which he could operate legitimately with institutional backing in exactly the space where Damien was most vulnerable. This wasn't improvised. This wasn't even just Isla's plan. This was architecture. Constructed over years by 2 people, one of whom Damien had underestimated and one of whom he had destroyed and forgotten about. Both of them patient, both of them waiting. He called Marcus back. I need everything you can find on Gavin Mercer's current professional relationships, specifically any consulting or advisory connection to federal regulatory bodies. A pause. Why? Because I think the inquiry into my accounts didn't come from a whistleblower inside the firm. I think it came from outside, deliberately targeted and timed. That would be, legal, Damien said, if done correctly. If the information was obtained through legitimate means and delivered to the right channels at the right moment, it would be completely legal. He paused. Which is how she would do it. Which is how both of them would do it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. If that's true, Damien, then the documentation she took from the study, that's not going to be used as private leverage. It's going to be filed. I know. It could already be filed. I know. That changes the landscape significantly. If it's already in federal hands, I know what it means, Marcus. His voice came out harder than he intended, and he stopped and breathed and tried to reconstruct the stillness. I need to find her, not to confront her. I need to know what she's already submitted. I told you not to make contact. I'm not going to make contact. I need to know where she is, who she's staying with, whether she's been in to see the federal team already. That's information. That's not contact. Another long pause. I'll make some calls, but Damien, I need you to sit still. I need you to not do anything. The worst thing you can do right now is move before we know what board is already in play. He agreed. He said the words. He hung up the phone and sat still for approximately 11 minutes, which was as long as he could manage. And then he opened his contacts and scrolled to a name he used rarely and always at cost. A private investigator named Roth, who charged $4,000 a day and asked the specific minimum number of questions required to do his job. Roth answered on the first ring. I need a locate, Damien said. No contact, no approach, just position. Who? My wife. A beat. Just one. That's domestic. Yes. Domestic locates carry additional, I'll double your rate. Another beat. I'll need a current photo and her last known vehicle. Damien provided both. He had the photo on his phone. Her at an event 8 months ago in a blue dress, looking somewhere to the left of the camera with an expression he had never been able to read. He had the vehicle information from memory. A gray 4-door she'd bought herself 2 years ago with money from her illustration work, money he had never bothered to track because it had seemed inconsequential. Nothing about Isla had seemed consequential. And that, he understood now, sitting in a midtown hotel room with a cold cup of coffee and an empty calendar and the architecture of his life collapsing through the floor, had been the single most consequential mistake of his life. Roth said he'd have a position by evening. Damien sat back and closed his eyes. He did not sleep. He sat with his eyes closed in the hotel chair and listened to the city outside the window and felt the hours moving. And sometime in the middle of the afternoon, his phone buzzed with a message from a number he recognized as belonging to the Times journalist. The message said only, "We're running the piece tomorrow morning. You have until 6 p.m. today if you want to comment." He stared at the message and understood that tomorrow morning, before he had located Isla, before his attorney had built any kind of defense position, before he had controlled a single element of the story was going to run without him. He started to type a response. Then his phone rang again. Not Marcus, not Roth, not the journalist. A number he didn't recognize. A 212 area code. Manhattan. No contact label. He answered. The voice on the other end was female, young and frightened in a very specific way. Not the frightened of someone in immediate danger, but the frightened of someone who has been holding a secret long enough that the weight of it has become unbearable, and they have finally, irrevocably decided to put it down. Is this Damien Cross? The voice said. Who is this? My name is... It doesn't matter. What matters is that I have something you need to know. A breath, short and shallow. It's about Isla, about what she found, and about something else. Something she hasn't told anyone yet. Another breath. Something that's going to change everything, and not the way you think. Damien sat forward in the chair. Talk, he said. The voice on the phone was still breathing. Damien hadn't spoken in several seconds. He was doing what he always did when confronted with an unknown variable, holding still, letting the silence work, waiting to see if the other person would fill it with something useful. It was a technique he had used in negotiations for 20 years. Silence as pressure, quiet as a tool. I'm listening, he said finally. I need you to understand that I'm not doing this to hurt anyone. The woman's voice had a tremor in it that sounded genuine rather than performed. I'm doing this because I don't have a choice anymore. I've been sitting on this for 3 weeks and I can't... She stopped, exhaled. I can't keep doing what I've been doing. Who are you? I work for a medical practice on the Upper East Side. I'm an administrative coordinator. A pause. I handle patient records, scheduling, confidential documentation. Damien said nothing. He was gripping the phone hard enough that the case creaked slightly in his palm. Your wife is a patient at our practice, the woman said. She came in 8 weeks ago for a consultation. The results from that appointment... Another stop, like she was calculating something, weighing the last available moment to turn back. She's pregnant, Mr. Cross. 8 weeks. I saw the file this morning when I was pulling records and I recognized the name and I... She kept talking, but Damien stopped hearing the words. Pregnant. 8 weeks. He set the phone down on the desk without ending the call and sat back in the chair with both hands flat on his thighs and stared at the wall opposite him. The hotel room wall was a neutral shade of gray that the designer had probably called something like stone or mist in the catalog. He looked at it without seeing it. He was doing arithmetic he didn't want to be doing. 8 weeks back from today, what had those 8 weeks looked like? Where had he been? How many nights had he not come home? How many mornings had she woken up in that apartment alone with something growing inside her and said nothing, shown nothing, given him absolutely no indication? He picked the phone back up. So I thought you should know before everything... Stop, he said. She stopped. Is she still a patient at your practice? Yes, she has a follow-up scheduled for... I don't need the date. He did need the date. He wasn't going to get it this way. Does she know you called me? No, God, no. Genuine alarm in the voice now. If anyone knew I accessed the file, I could lose my license. I could be... Nobody's going to know you called. He made his voice even, almost gentle, the register he used when he needed something from someone frightened. I'm going to ask you one more question, and I need a straight answer. Is there any chance the child isn't mine? A silence that lasted too long. I don't know that, she said. I only know what's in the file. He ended the call. He sat in the chair for a long time. The afternoon light had shifted while he wasn't paying attention, moving from the flat brightness of midday to the amber slant of early evening, and the city outside the window had changed its pitch from aggressive to something lower and more continuous. He had sat in this chair and aged somehow, without moving, without doing anything, just by receiving information. A child. His wife was carrying a child and she had left without telling him. She had packed 7 years of her life into whatever she could carry and walked out of a marriage and sold the apartment and set a federal inquiry in motion and had done all of it, while carrying a secret that should have, in any version of events he could have predicted, been leverage enough to keep her at the table. Most people in her position would have used it. Most people would have walked in with that information and placed it on the table like a card and said, negotiate. Isla hadn't. Isla had taken it with her. That was the detail that wouldn't settle. Not the pregnancy itself, but the decision to conceal it. The decision to leave without using it, without telling him, without giving him the knowledge that might have... He stopped that thought before it completed itself, because completing it required him to answer honestly what he would have done with that information, and the honest answer was not a comfortable one. He stood up. He went to the bathroom and ran cold water over his wrists, an old habit from boarding school, something a roommate had taught him for managing the body's response to high-pressure situations. He looked at his reflection in the mirror above the sink. He looked like what he was, a man who hadn't slept, hadn't eaten properly, and had spent 16 hours watching everything he built resist being rebuilt. He went back to the desk and called Marcus. "There's a development," he said without preamble. "Good or bad?" "Complicated." He told Marcus about the phone call. He did not identify the woman by name because she hadn't given him a name, and because identifying her would have required acknowledging that she had violated patient confidentiality to give him the information, which was not a position he wanted to put on record. He gave Marcus only the facts. Isla was pregnant. 8 weeks. She had not disclosed this. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That changes the divorce landscape considerably. This isn't about the divorce landscape. Damien, a child is involved. My child. He paused. That changes what she's doing. It changes what all of this is. She's not just trying to protect herself from the marriage. She's trying to protect herself and a child from me. "I hear you saying that like it's a discovery," Marcus said carefully. The words sat in the air of the hotel room. "Set up a meeting," Damien said. "I need to understand my parental rights as they currently stand before anything is filed, before the divorce petition hits the court." "Damien, I strongly advise against using a pregnancy as a legal..." "I'm not using anything. I'm asking about my rights as a potential father. That is a legal question I'm entitled to ask my attorney." His voice had gone flat and quiet in the way that Marcus had learned, over 11 years, meant the conversation was over except for the part where Marcus gave him what he asked for. "Set up the meeting, tomorrow morning." He hung up. He needed air. He took the elevator to the lobby, walked through the hotel doors into the October evening, and kept walking. No direction, no destination, just movement because sitting still in that room any longer was not something his body would allow. He walked cross town, then uptown, hands in his coat pockets, hat down, chin down, the posture of a man who doesn't want to be recognized in a city full of people who recognize him. He thought about the baby. He wasn't a man who had wanted children, or rather, he had never given the subject enough sustained attention to know what he wanted. Isla had brought it up twice in 7 years, gently, in the oblique way she brought up anything that mattered to her, and he had redirected both times with something vague about timing and professional obligations, and she had nodded and said nothing more, and he had told himself the subject was closed. He had never considered that she might have filed it somewhere quiet and continued wanting it anyway, continued hoping, continued being the kind of woman who kept the kitchen light on even when nobody thanked her for it. 8 weeks ago, she had found out she was carrying his child. Then she had gone home and looked at her life and started packing. He stopped walking at the corner of Lexington and 68th. A cab nearly clipped him from behind, and the driver leaned on the horn, and Damien stepped back onto the curb without looking. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets and the city pouring around him in every direction, and felt something he didn't have a word for. Not guilt, not grief, not anger. Something that contained all three and was ultimately just a specific variety of too late. His phone buzzed. Roth. He answered immediately. "I have a location," Roth said. "Upper West Side. Residential building on West 84th. She arrived this afternoon around 2 o'clock with 2 other individuals. One male, early 40s, I'm reading as Gavin Mercer from your description. One female, unknown, late 30s, possibly legal counsel based on the bag and the general posture." A pause. "She looks well for what it's worth." "It's worth nothing," Damien said. "What floor?" "I don't have floor access. I have building exterior and entry confirmation. You said no approach." "I know what I said." He was already moving. He flagged a cab from the corner. "Text me the address." "Damien." Roth used his first name, which he had never done before in 6 years of professional relationship. "The counsel with her, if that's what she is. And the other man, and the fact that she's gone here rather than to a family address or a hotel. This looks like a prepared position. This looks like a place she was already planning to go, which means there may be other people inside. Legal, security, maybe more. Text me the address, Damien said again. The address arrived as the cab pulled into traffic. He gave the driver the cross streets and sat back and looked at his phone and thought about what he was doing and made the decision to continue doing it anyway. Because the alternative was returning to the hotel room and sitting in that chair and waiting. And he had done enough waiting in the last 24 hours to understand that waiting was not something he could survive right now. He needed to see her. Not to threaten, not to take anything back. He told himself that and tried to believe it. He needed to look at her face. He needed to understand from the reality of her physical presence rather than the accumulating testimony of everyone around him who this woman actually was, who she had become. Whether the Isla Rowan he thought he had known for 7 years bore any relationship to the woman who had done all of this with a patience that bordered on architectural. The cab pulled up on West 84th. He paid and got out. The building was a pre-war 6-story, well-maintained with a doorman visible through the glass lobby doors. Damien stood on the opposite side of the street under a scaffolded section of sidewalk and looked up at the building and felt the particular helplessness of a man accustomed to walking into any room he chose, now standing outside a door that would not open for him. He was still standing there when the building's lobby doors opened and Gavin Mercer walked out. He saw Damien immediately. The street wasn't wide enough for pretense, and neither of them had the energy for it. Gavin stopped on the sidewalk, looked at him across the street, and then crossed without waiting for the light, which gave Damien a brief and uncharacteristic moment of scrambled preparation. Gavin stopped 3 feet from him. Up close, in the evening light, he looked older than he had in the lobby that morning. Not tired, just older, the way people look when they've been carrying something for a long time and the weight has left its mark. "You hired someone," Gavin said. It wasn't a question. "I needed to know she was safe." Gavin looked at him for a moment. "That might be the first honest thing you've said in this entire situation." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "The measured thing, the reasonable thing." Damien's voice came out rougher than he intended. "I need to talk to her." "No." "Gavin, no." Flat, final, not angry, just immovable. "You don't get to decide that. She decides that. And she's made her decision." "She's pregnant." The words came out before he had fully chosen to say them. He watched Gavin's face and what moved across it in the half-second after, not surprise, not discomfort, not the awkwardness of a man who didn't know. What moved across Gavin Mercer's face was confirmation, the look of a man who already knew. "She told you," Damien said. "She tells me things," Gavin said carefully, "because she trusts me, which is a concept I understand you might have trouble with." Something shifted in Damien's chest. Not the manageable pressure of earlier, not the controlled anger he could direct and deploy, but something messier and less civilized, something that moved up from somewhere below his ribs and arrived in his throat as words he hadn't prepared. "That's my child," he said, "and she's the mother." Gavin didn't step back. He didn't raise his voice. "And she gets to decide what kind of father gets access to that child. And right now, today, with federal investigators going through your financial records and your attorney in crisis mode, and your mistress giving statements to the DA's office." "She's giving what?" Gavin stopped. The street noise filled the space between them. A bus, someone's music from a passing car, a dog barking 2 blocks away. "Celeste is giving statements," Damien said. Not a question, not fury, just the flat, cold arrival of information that reconfigured everything. "She went to the DA." Gavin's jaw tightened slightly. He had let something slip. He knew it, and Damien knew it, and both of them were very aware of this shared knowledge in the space between them. "She came to Isla first," Gavin said. 2 days ago. She showed up with a flash drive and a terror that was real enough that we took her seriously." He paused. "The things on that drive, Damien, the recordings, the payment transfers, the correspondence, those aren't things that can be explained away. Those aren't offshore structures where the argument is about interpretation and accounting methodology. Those are conversations where you said specific things to specific people about what you intended to do." Damien's body had gone completely still. "What conversations?" "About the firm, about the accounts, about what you were planning to do if the federal inquiry got too close." Gavin watched his face. "Did you know Celeste was recording your conversations?" The answer was no. The answer was that he had spent 14 months believing Celeste Fairmore was a woman who existed in an entirely separate compartment of his life, available, discreet, asking nothing beyond what he offered and offering nothing beyond what was asked. He had believed this because believing it was convenient and because examining it more closely would have required him to be a person he didn't want to be. "I need to know what's on the drive," he said. "You need an attorney." "I have an attorney. I need to know what's on the drive." "The DA's office has what's on the drive." Gavin stepped back, half a step, the first physical retreat he had made in the conversation. "I'll tell you one more thing, and then I'm going inside and you're going to leave this block and not come back." A pause. "She has 17 recordings. Some of them are phone calls. Some of them are in-person conversations. Several of them are from your apartment." Another pause. "Celeste had access to your apartment for 14 months, Damien. Think about that carefully." He thought about it carefully. He thought about it standing on West 84th Street in the October dark, while Gavin Mercer walked back into the building and the doorman closed the glass door and the lock engaged with a sound that was small and definitive and total. 17 recordings, made in his apartment, by a woman he had trusted not because he had assessed her trustworthiness, but because she had been there and she had been convenient, and it had never occurred to him to ask what she wanted from the situation beyond what he was giving her. It had never occurred to him that she was building something. Just as it had never occurred to him that Isla was building something. Just as it had never occurred to him that Gavin Mercer, stripped and discarded 6 years ago, had spent those years constructing the exact set of circumstances required to... He walked. He didn't take a cab. He walked. Because walking was the only thing his body would do. Back downtown through the dark city, 17 blocks, 20, without feeling the distance. He was assembling the full picture for the first time, and it was worse than anything he had modeled. It was worse because it wasn't chaos. It wasn't a set of opportunistic attacks that had landed simultaneously by bad luck. It was a structure. It was a plan with multiple authors who had each contributed their piece without any one of them having to carry the whole weight of it. Isla had the documents and the legal architecture. Gavin had the institutional connections and the federal access. Celeste, deliberately, or perhaps both deliberately and opportunistically, had 17 recordings from inside his own home. 3 different people, 3 different angles of approach, all of it converging at the same moment. He had spent 20 years building a life no one could take from him, and he had handed it to 3 different people in 3 different ways and never noticed any of them catching it. He was back at the hotel by 9. He went upstairs. He sat at the desk. He looked at his phone and saw a message from Marcus. "Board meeting called for tomorrow 8 a.m. Your presence has been requested but not required." Harlan Voss's words exactly. Requested but not required. In 20 years with his board, Damien had never once received those words. Requested but not required was the language of a board that was preparing to act without him. Requested but not required was the language of men who had already made their decision and were offering him the courtesy of witnessing it. He set the phone face down on the desk. He thought about Isla, upstairs in that building on West 84th, with whatever quiet she had built for herself in the months of planning. He thought about her sitting in a room that had nothing of him in it, no trace, no smell, no reminder. And he tried to imagine what that felt like for her. He tried to imagine the specific texture of that particular freedom. He couldn't. He didn't have the vocabulary for it. He had never understood what it cost her to live in the version of their life that he had constructed, and so he had no way to understand what it felt like when she finally stepped outside of it. He opened his laptop. He found the name of the DA who was handling the inquiry. He searched for everything public about the case timeline. He searched for Celeste Fairmore and found nothing new, which meant she was being kept out of the press coverage, which meant she had cooperated in exchange for something, which meant the agreement was already made and the terms were already set, and whatever Celeste had traded away in those 17 recordings was already in the hands of people whose job was to use it. At 11:15, his phone rang again. He looked at the screen, a number he didn't know, area code 646. He answered. "Mr. Cross?" A man's voice. Professional, measured, with the specific flatness of someone who makes calls like this regularly and has learned not to let any color into his voice. "My name is Agent Daniel Forsyth. I'm with the Federal Investigation Unit currently conducting a preliminary inquiry into Cross Capital Holdings. I'm calling to inform you that we will be requesting your voluntary presence for a preliminary interview at our offices tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. Damien said nothing. You are not required to attend without counsel, and we strongly encourage you to have legal representation present. A brief pause. However, I want to be direct with you, Mr. Cross. Several individuals with significant knowledge of your financial operations have already provided detailed testimony. The evidentiary picture at this stage is substantial. Another pause, shorter. Being present tomorrow and engaging cooperatively would be significantly more advantageous than the alternative. Damien's hand on the phone was completely steady. He had gone somewhere cold and very still inside himself, the place he went in negotiations when everything was on the table, and the only thing left was to decide what kind of person you were going to be in the next 60 seconds. I'll have my attorney contact your office in the morning, he said. That's fine. We'll expect Agent Forsyth. Damien's voice was quiet. Careful, precise, in the way that a man is precise when he is trying not to break something fragile. The individuals who provided testimony. I'd like to understand the scope of. I can't speak to the specifics of testimony provided by other parties, Mr. Cross. You understand. Of course. He paused. Can you tell me the flash drive evidence? Has it been fully processed? A silence that lasted almost 2 full seconds. I'm not in a position to discuss evidentiary specifics at this stage. Understood. He paused again. I'll see you at 2. He hung up. He sat without moving for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Marcus and told him about the call, and told him to be at the hotel by 7 in the morning, and told him to clear his entire schedule for the foreseeable future. Marcus said things that Damien registered as words without processing their content. He said yes in the right places and ended the call. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling and understood, with the full and unobstructed clarity of a man who has run out of angles, that tomorrow was not a day where he would be able to control the narrative. Tomorrow was a day where the narrative would arrive in a room at 2 p.m. and sit across from him in the form of federal agents with 17 recordings and a flash drive and testimony from people who had known him, who had, each in their own way, been close enough to him to see clearly what he had constructed and what he had hidden. And it would speak, and he would have to listen. He had spent his entire adult life as the person who controlled what happened in rooms, and there was something in the certainty of that reversal, something in the knowledge that tomorrow that control was gone, that the room would not bend to him, that the people in it were not people he could read or redirect or manage, that produced in the deepest part of him a fear that was not like the fear he had felt the night before. The night before had been the fear of loss. Tonight was something older and more primitive than that. Tonight was the fear of a man who has been powerful so long that he has forgotten what he is without it, standing at the edge of finding out. He did not sleep. At 3 in the morning, he was still sitting at the desk when his phone lit up with a message from a number he now recognized as belonging to Roth. The message contained no words, just a photograph, slightly blurred and taken from a distance with a long lens, obviously through a window from street level, the kind of image that existed in a legal gray zone that Damien had crossed into without fully deciding to. The photograph showed Ayla. She was sitting in a lit room several floors up, at a table, her hands wrapped around a cup of something warm. She was wearing a soft gray sweater. Her hair was loose. She was looking down at something on the table that the angle didn't show clearly, but whatever it was, she was reading it with an expression of concentration, not distress, not fear, concentration. The expression of a person engaged in a task she has chosen, in a place she has chosen. In the first hours of a life she has also chosen. She looked, from that blurred distance, like someone who had put something down and found that her hands were lighter than she remembered. Damien looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he set the phone down face down on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the surface and understood that the woman in that photograph, sitting in a lit window at 3 in the morning with her hands around a warm cup, carrying his child and her own plans and a stillness he had never once in 7 years thought to look for, was not the woman he had thought he was married to. She never had been. He had simply never looked carefully enough to see who was actually there. And now it was too late to look. And tomorrow at 2 p.m., A federal agent named Forsyth would sit across from him in a government office and begin asking questions, and somewhere across the city, a woman in a gray sweater would continue reading whatever was on that table. And the distance between those two rooms, the distance between where Damian Cross was and where Isla Rowan had gotten herself to, was not a distance measured in city blocks. It was measured in years of choices, and every single one of them had been his. He was at Marcus's office by 6:45 in the morning. Not because Marcus had asked him to be there at 6:45, Marcus had said 7. But the hotel room had become a container that Damian's body refused to stay inside of, and he had dressed in yesterday's suit, the only suit he had, because he had left his apartment with nothing, and walked the 12 blocks through a city that was still assembling itself in the gray pre-dawn, the delivery trucks and the early joggers and the bodega owners rolling up their gates, all of it moving at the specific tempo of a place that doesn't acknowledge your emergency. Marcus was already there when Damian arrived, which meant Marcus had also not slept, or had slept briefly and badly and given up. He was behind his desk with 2 cups of coffee and a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting, and the expression of a man who has spent the night cataloging damage and arrived at a number he doesn't want to say out loud. Damian sat down across from him without taking off his coat. "Tell me the worst of it first," Damian said. Marcus picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking. "The 17 recordings. I spoke with a contact in the DA's office at midnight. Off the record, professional courtesy, nothing I can use formally. The content is extensive." He looked at the legal pad. "Several of the recordings document conversations about the offshore structures in enough detail that intent can be established. Not just the structures themselves, which might be defensible as aggressive but legal tax positioning, but the intent behind them. Conversations where you discussed what those structures were designed to conceal and from whom." Damian said nothing. "2 of the recordings are from meetings that took place in your apartment. One is a phone call where you discussed, with specificity, what you planned to do if the cross-capital inquiry got close enough to require action." Marcus finally looked up from the pad. "The phrase my contact used was, and I'm quoting, unambiguous." "How did she get those recordings?" Damian's voice was flat. "Celeste, how did she get the in-apartment recordings?" "A device. Probably multiple devices. She had access to the apartment for over a year." Marcus paused. "Damian, I have to ask you this directly. Did you know she was doing this?" "No." "Is there any possibility she was working with someone from the beginning, not just eventually bringing the recordings to Isla, but recording deliberately from the start as part of a coordinated—" "I don't know." Damian stood up. He couldn't sit. The chair was wrong. The angle was wrong. His body needed to be vertical. He moved to the window. Manhattan below was coming fully awake. The morning rush thickening, the cabs multiplying, the sidewalks filling with people who were going somewhere they had chosen to go. "I don't know whether she was coordinating with Isla from the beginning, or whether she came to this separately and they found each other later. It doesn't change what's on the recordings." "No," Marcus agreed. "It doesn't." He picked up the legal pad. "The board meeting is in 90 minutes. Harlan Voss has already drafted a suspension notice pending investigation. Your CFO, Raymond, has retained his own attorney, which means he's cooperating and distancing simultaneously. The 2 partners below you who had access to the offshore documentation have also separately retained counsel." He set the pad down. "You are going to walk into that board meeting and you are going to be suspended from all operational roles at Cross Capital. That is going to happen regardless of anything you say or do in that room." Damian turned from the window. "Then why am I going?" "Because not going is worse. Not going becomes the image, the CEO who ran rather than faced it. You go. You sit in that room, you say as little as possible, and you let me speak for you, and you do not, under any circumstances, lose your composure." "I don't lose my composure." Marcus looked at him steadily. "You've been awake for 36 hours. You have a federal interview at 2 this afternoon. Your wife is pregnant with your child and is currently residing in a secured location with the man whose company you dismantled, and the evidence she's carrying is already in federal hands." He paused. "I'm not challenging your composure. I'm reminding you that today is the day it matters most." Damian picked up the coffee Marcus had brought for him. It was already going cold. He drank it anyway. The board meeting was in a conference room on the 41st floor of a building on Park Avenue that Cross Capital shared with 2 other firms. Damien had been in this room hundreds of times. He knew the angle of the morning light through the east-facing windows, the particular temperature the climate control maintained regardless of the season, the faint smell of the leather chairs that he had chosen himself 8 years ago from a supplier in Florence. He walked in at 8:02 and the room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when the person everyone has been talking about walks through the door. Harlan Voss was at the head of the table. 70 years old, silver-haired, in a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, with the controlled neutrality of a man who has made decisions that ended careers before and has made his peace with the necessity of doing so. Around him were 7 other board members. Damien knew all of them, had eaten with them, negotiated with them, played golf with 3 of them on courses that cost more to join than most people made in a year. None of them met his eyes when he walked in. He sat in his chair, the one to the right of the head of the table, the position he had occupied for 11 years, and Marcus sat beside him. And Harlan Voss opened a folder in front of him and said without any preamble at all, "Thank you for being here, Damien." The words "thank you for being here," said in that tone, in this context, were among the most brutal things Harlan Voss had ever said to him. And Harlan Voss had said some brutal things in 20 years of business. "The board has been in consultation since yesterday afternoon," Harlan continued. "We have reviewed the preliminary federal inquiry documentation, we have received counsel from our legal team, and we have spoken individually with several members of the executive team." He looked down at the folder. "Effective as of close of business today, the board is implementing an administrative suspension of your operational authority, pending the conclusion of the federal investigation. All executive decisions will be routed through the COO under interim oversight protocols." He looked up. "This is not a termination. It is a protective measure for the firm." Damien's hands were flat on the table. He could feel his own pulse in his palms. "I understand," he said. "We need your access credentials and device passwords surrendered to legal by noon." "Understood. Your attorney will receive the full documentation of the suspension terms within the hour." "Fine." Harlan Voss looked at him for a moment, and something moved behind his eyes. Not quite sympathy, not quite guilt, but something in that family of feelings. The look of a man who has known another man for a long time and is genuinely sorry about the specific shape of the thing he's doing. "Is there anything you'd like to say, Damien?" He thought about everything he could say. He thought about the arguments he could make, the counter-narratives he could construct, the version of events in which this was a coordinated attack by motivated adversaries, and he was the wronged party, and the board had an obligation to stand beside their CEO rather than abandon him at the first sign of federal attention. He had that argument fully assembled and ready. He had been assembling it since 3 in the morning. He looked at Harlan and said, "No." Because saying it would have been the performance of a man who still believed the performance could change the outcome. And he was too tired for the performance and too clear-eyed about the outcome. He left the building at 8:40 with Marcus beside him and stood on the Park Avenue sidewalk and felt the October air hit his face and tried to remember what he had done with the 30 minutes before his first board meeting 11 years ago. Whether he had been nervous, whether he had felt anything at all beyond the particular hunger of a man who wanted things and believed he was going to get them. He couldn't remember. It felt like someone else's morning. 2 hours, Marcus said. Rest. Eat something. We reconvene at noon to prepare for the federal interview. I'm not going back to the hotel. Damien, I need to walk. He was already moving. I'll be at your office at noon. He walked again. He walked the way he had walked the night before without direction, letting the city take him where the lights and the foot traffic and the turning of corners decided. He ended up in Central Park without entirely meaning to, on one of the paths that ran along the east side under trees that had gone full October color overnight, red and amber, and a yellow so intense it looked almost artificial against the gray sky. He sat on a bench. He was still sitting there 40 minutes later when his phone rang with a number he recognized as belonging to Raymond, his CFO. He answered. You shouldn't be calling me, Damien said. I know. Raymond's voice was rough. He sounded like a man who had been awake longer than Damien, which was difficult to imagine. I wanted you to hear this from me rather than from the attorneys. I cooperated. I gave them everything they asked for: the account structures, the transfer documentation, the communications. A pause. I had no choice. My attorney told me the alternative was, I know what the alternative was, Raymond. Damien. His voice cracked slightly. Raymond Chu had been his CFO for 8 years. They had built the offshore architecture together, piece by piece, in meetings that always ended with a handshake and a shared understanding that what happened in those meetings stayed between them. I'm sorry. I need you to know I'm sorry. Damien looked at the trees. The wind moved through them, and a cascade of amber leaves came down in a slow spiraling fall across the path. Are you? He said. Yes. Then why did you help me build something you were willing to dismantle the moment it became personally inconvenient? A silence, long enough that Damien could hear street noise bleeding through the connection from wherever Raymond was standing. I'm going to hang up now, Raymond. Damien! He ended the call. He sat in the park for another 20 minutes. Then he stood up and oriented himself and walked, with purpose this time, toward the DA's office. He had not planned to do this. Marcus had explicitly, in the language of a man who chooses his explicit warnings carefully, told him not to make unilateral contact with any party in the investigation before the 2 p.m. interview. He had agreed. He was now choosing not to honor that agreement, because something in him had shifted in the last hour. In the boardroom, in the park, in Raymond's cracked voice on the phone, and the shift had produced a clarity that was different from all the clarity he had experienced in the last 36 hours. Less strategic, more fundamental. He needed to see Isla. Not because she would be at the DA's office. She might not be. But she was somewhere in the motion of this day, somewhere in the orbit of the people who were taking his life apart with federal authorization, and the need to be in the same room as her had become something his body insisted on, with a persistence that overrode his attorney's instructions and his own better judgment. He walked 12 blocks and turned onto the street where the DA's office building stood, and he was 60 feet from the entrance when he saw her. She was coming out. She was with a woman he didn't recognize, late 30s, dark coat, the posture of legal counsel, as Roth had described. And she was wearing a long camel-colored coat he had never seen before, which meant she had bought it recently, or it had been somewhere he hadn't had access to, which meant it was a piece of her life that existed entirely outside of him. Her hair was pulled back. She was carrying a leather folder under one arm. She was listening to the woman beside her with a focused attention that he recognized from the 2 or 3 times in their marriage he had said something that actually required her full engagement. She looked focused. She looked well-rested. She looked like a woman in the middle of a task she had been preparing for long enough that the execution of it had stopped being frightening and had become instead just work. She hadn't seen him yet. He had approximately 4 seconds to decide what to do before she either saw him or turned the other direction and the moment closed. 4 seconds in which the version of himself that Marcus had spent 11 years advising, controlled, strategic, never moving without a calculated purpose, argued clearly and correctly for turning around and walking back the way he had come. He didn't turn around. Isla. Her name, in his voice, on a Manhattan sidewalk at 10:40 in the morning. He had said it thousands of times in 7 years. In the specific register, he said it now, and not commanding, not managing, not the habitual tone of a man who uses a name the way he uses a tool. It sounded different. It sounded like what it actually was. One person saying the name of another person because they needed to, and there was no calculation behind the need. She stopped. The woman beside her went still. Her hand moved slightly, reflexively, toward her phone. Isla turned. She looked at him across the distance on the sidewalk with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not anger, not fear. Something closer to recognition. The look of a person who has fully prepared for something and is now watching it arrive exactly as expected. You can't be here, she said. Her voice was even, completely even. I know. My attorney is going to... She glanced at the woman beside her, and the woman was already typing something on her phone, already managing the situation, already building the record. Damien, you need to leave. I need 5 minutes. You don't get 5 minutes. Isla... No. She stepped forward 1 step toward him, and something in the directness of the movement stopped him. She had never in 7 years of marriage moved toward him in a moment of conflict. She had always stilled or stepped back or turned slightly sideways in the way of a person trying to make themselves smaller. She moved toward him now with the full weight of her presence and looked at him straight on and said, quietly and without any performance at all, "You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up outside a federal building and use my name on a public sidewalk like that's something that belongs to you. I am not something that belongs to you." His throat was tight. "I know that." "Do you?" Not accusatory, genuinely asking. "Because you have spent 7 years acting like you didn't." "I know." The words came out with nothing attached to them. No justification, no qualification, no pivot to the strategic, just the two words standing alone. "I know that." She looked at him for a moment. The woman beside her said, "Isla," in a low, warning voice, and Isla made a small gesture with one hand, barely a movement, just a slight lift of the fingers, that silenced her. "Are you all right?" Isla said, not warm, not unkind. The question of a person who has removed someone from her life but has not removed her basic recognition of them as a human being. The question undid something in him that had been holding since the night before. Not dramatically. It didn't produce anything visible on his face, nothing she would have been able to point to, but something internal, something structural, gave. "No," he said, "I'm not." "I know." She paused. "You should go, Damien. Your attorney is going to be very unhappy that you're here." "There's something I need to say." "You need to say it through your attorney." "I can't say this through my attorney." He took a breath. The October air came into his lungs cold and sharp. "I know about the baby." Something moved across her face. Just for a moment. Not shock. She had been prepared for this too. She had been prepared for everything. But something real. Something that was hers and not managed or planned. It passed quickly. She reclosed whatever had opened. "That is not a conversation we're having here," she said. "I know. I'm not trying to use it. I'm not building a legal argument. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I just needed you to know that I know, and that I'm not going to make it something I use against you." She looked at him for a long time. The city moved around them, indifferent and continuous. "I don't believe you," she said, not cruel, just honest. "And the fact that I don't believe you is not something I'm willing to feel bad about right now." "That's fair. Please leave." He left. He walked away from her on the sidewalk and did not look back because looking back was the gesture of a man still hoping to recover something. And he was trying, badly, imperfectly, against every instinct he had, to be a man who was done recovering things that hadn't belonged to him correctly in the first place. He was half a block away when his phone exploded. 3 messages from Marcus in 30 seconds, each one escalating in tone from professional urgency to something approaching controlled panic. The third message said, "Call me right now. Something has happened." He called. "Where are you?" Marcus said, answering before the first ring completed. "Midtown. What happened?" "The recordings. The DA's office just released a statement. Not the full recordings, but a summary of content. It's already on the wire. Financial News picked it up at 10:53. A pause in which Damien could hear Marcus breathing. "There's a specific recording, Damien, a conversation from 8 months ago in your apartment where you are on record discussing what to do if the federal inquiry reached a specific threshold. And in that conversation you reference using a pregnancy as leverage." Damien stopped walking. He stopped on the sidewalk and people moved around him like water around a stone, and he stood completely still and went back 8 months in his mind, to a night in the apartment, to a conversation with— He was trying to place it, trying to identify which night, which conversation, what he had said, and in what context. "I don't—" he started. "Let me finish." Marcus's voice had gone very quiet. "The recording captures you saying, and I'm reading directly from the summary. If she ever gets pregnant, that's the end of everything she thinks she's building. I'd own every decision she made from that point forward." End quote. A pause. "That was before she was pregnant, Damien. That was a hypothetical. But in the context of the current situation, a pregnant wife who has left the marriage and is cooperating with federal investigators, that statement is going to be read in one way and one way only." The sidewalk felt unstable. Not literally. It was concrete. It was solid. It was exactly what it had always been. But Damien's relationship to its solidity had changed in the last 15 seconds in a way he could feel in his knees. That was taken out of context, he said. I know. That was a business conversation about contingency planning for a completely different... Damien, I know. Marcus's voice was very careful now, the voice of someone handling a situation with the same delicacy you'd use to handle something that could shatter. What matters is not the context. What matters is that statement exists, is now public in summary form, and Isla Rowan's legal team is going to be in front of a judge within the hour, using it to establish a pattern of intent to use a pregnancy as a weapon of control. A long pause. Which means every protective order they've been preparing, the financial restrictions, the custody pre-filings, the restraining documentation, all of it is going to be fast-tracked. Today. Not next week. Today. Damien turned around. He was looking back up the block toward the DA's office, toward the sidewalk where Isla had been standing, which was now empty. She had gone back inside or moved on. The spot where she had stood returned to anonymous pavement with no trace of the conversation that had just happened on it. I need to get ahead of this, he said. You cannot get ahead of this. This is already in front of you. Marcus's voice took on an edge. Not anger, but the specific edge of an attorney who has advised against a series of decisions and is now watching the consequence of those decisions arrive all at once. What you need to do is get to my office right now, and we are going to go through the 2 p.m. interview preparation, and you are going to answer every question I ask you with complete honesty, including the parts that are difficult, because if there are additional recordings that we have not yet accounted for, I need to know the full landscape before we walk into that federal building. There are no additional recordings. You told me there were no recordings at all. The words landed. Damien closed his eyes for a moment, standing on the sidewalk in the middle of Manhattan at 11 in the morning, with his board having suspended him and his CFO having cooperated, and his mistress's recordings now summarized on wire services, and his wife carrying his child in a building whose address he knew because he had hired someone to follow her. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. He got a cab. He sat in the back seat with his hands on his thighs and his eyes forward, watching the city pass through the scratched plexiglass divider, and tried to build something, anything, that resembled a position, a place to stand, a version of the next 12 hours that ended somewhere other than a federal interview room where he had nothing to offer and everything was already known. He couldn't build it. The materials weren't there. Marcus's office? Noon. 2 hours of preparation that consisted primarily of Marcus asking questions and Damien answering them, and Marcus writing things on the legal pad, and occasionally setting the pen down and looking at him with the specific expression of a man who has heard something that changes the shape of the problem significantly. They went through the offshore accounts. They went through the transfer records. They went through the recordings as Marcus understood them from the DA's summary. They went through the board meeting and Raymond's phone call and Damien's unauthorized appearance outside the DA's office, which produced the longest pause of the session. You spoke to her, Marcus said. Yes. What did you say? I told her I knew about the pregnancy and I wasn't going to use it against her. Marcus set the pen down. Why? Damien looked at his attorney across the desk. Because it was true. Marcus picked the pen back up. He wrote something on the pad. He said nothing about it, which was a particular kind of professional mercy that Damien recognized and felt, though he couldn't have explained either the recognition or the feeling. They arrived at the federal building at 1:50. The lobby had the specific architecture of institutional authority, high ceilings, security screening, the efficient movement of people who worked there every day treating it as ordinary. Marcus handled the check-in. Damien stood beside him and looked at his own reflection in the polished surface of the security desk and barely recognized the man looking back. Not because he looked dramatically different, because the thing behind the eyes was different. The particular quality of certainty that had lived there for 20 years. The certainty of a man who has power and knows it and has organized every other aspect of himself around that knowledge, was gone. In its place was something he didn't have a name for, something raw, something that had fewer defenses but might, in some way he couldn't yet identify, be more honest. They were taken to a conference room on the 4th floor. 3 federal agents were already seated. A woman at the head of the table, mid-40s, reading glasses pushed up on her head, a manner that was precise without being performative, introduced herself as Special Agent Carla Drake. She was the lead on the inquiry. She had the kind of focus that made you feel, when she looked at you, like the room had gotten smaller. She looked at Damien. "Mr. Cross," she said, "thank you for coming in voluntarily." He sat down across from her. "Before we begin," she said, and placed a folder on the table, "I want to make you aware of something. We received additional documentation this morning, physical documentation." She opened the folder. "Documents that appear to have originated from a personal safe in your former residence." She looked up. "You're aware of what documents we're referring to?" "Yes," Damien said, "and you're aware that these documents, combined with the recorded material and the testimony already provided, create a fairly comprehensive picture of the financial structures we're investigating." "I'm aware." She folded her hands on top of the folder. "Then let me ask you directly, Mr. Cross, because I find direct questions save everyone considerable time." She paused. "Is there anything you'd like to tell us before we begin? Anything at all that you believe we might not already know?" Damien looked at Agent Drake across the table. He looked at the folder. He thought about the 7 years of decisions that had assembled themselves into this room, this afternoon, this specific arrangement of people and documents and consequences. He thought about Isla in a gray sweater at 3 in the morning, with her hands around a warm cup, reading something she had chosen to read in a life she had chosen to build. He thought about what he had said to her on the sidewalk. The only true thing he could remember saying to another person in longer than he could cleanly account for. "I know." He placed his hands flat on the table, the same posture he had held in the boardroom that morning, and took a breath and opened his mouth to speak. And at that precise moment, the door to the conference room opened, and a young agent leaned in and said something quietly into Drake's ear, and whatever it was made her expression shift. Just slightly, just a degree, the way a needle moves when it encounters something unexpected. And she looked up from the whispered message and looked directly at Damien with an expression that was no longer just focused, but was now something closer to resolved. "Mr. Cross," she said, "it appears your wife has just arrived in the building." The room went very still. Not the stillness of people who have stopped moving, the stillness of people who have stopped pretending that what is happening is ordinary. Agent Drake's hands remained folded on the folder. The two agents flanking her did not look at each other. Marcus, beside Damien, made no sound. The young agent who had delivered the message was already closing the door, already retreating from the room with the careful efficiency of someone who understands they have just changed the temperature of a situation and wants to get clear of it. Damien said nothing. Drake watched him for a moment. "We weren't expecting her until tomorrow," she said, and it wasn't clear whether she was speaking to him or to the room. "She's asked to provide a supplementary statement, in person." She unfolded her hands. "We're going to take a brief recess, 15 minutes. She stood. The two flanking agents stood. They filed out with the particular synchrony of people who have worked together long enough to move like a single organism, and the door closed behind them, and Damien was left in the conference room with Marcus and the folder and the institutional quiet of a federal building on a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus turned to him immediately. "Do not speak to her." "I know. I mean, in this building, in any hallway, in any room that is not explicitly arranged by counsel with both attorneys present. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Damien," Marcus's voice dropped. "I need to know. Is there anything on those documents, anything in those recordings, anything in the testimony already provided that you have not told me? Anything at all that is going to walk through that door with her?" Damien looked at the table. The surface was clean, government-issue laminate, the kind of surface that holds no warmth. He had spent his career across tables like this, conference tables, negotiating tables, board tables, and had always known, going in, what cards he held. He had always built his position around the architecture of what he knew and what the other side didn't. "There's one thing," he said. Marcus went very still. 3 years ago, before the offshore structures were fully established, there was a period, 6 months, where the transfer routing went through an account that had a secondary signature authorization. He paused. The secondary signature was Raymond's. He didn't know what he was authorizing. I structured the documentation so that it looked like standard operational transfers. If the investigators pull the full chain on that account, they will find his signature on transactions he has no knowledge of having approved. Marcus stared at him. "You forged his authorization. I structured it so his existing signature authority was applied to transactions outside its designated scope, without his knowledge." "That is forgery, Damien." "I know what it is. And Raymond is currently cooperating with the federal investigation, which means he is going to be asked about every transaction he ever signed, and when he says he has no knowledge of those specific transfers, it will look like he's lying to protect himself, Damien said. Yes, I know. The silence in the room had a different quality now, not the silence of people holding still. The silence of something that has been said and cannot be unsaid, sitting in the air between two people who both understand its weight. Why are you telling me this now? Marcus said. Damien looked at his attorney. 11 years. 11 years of this man building walls around Damien's decisions and calling it legal counsel. 11 years of both of them understanding, without ever saying directly, that their professional relationship was organized around protecting a set of choices that did not survive contact with daylight. Because Raymond didn't do it, Damien said, and they're going to think he did. Marcus sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back down at Damien, and what was on his face was not the expression of an attorney recalibrating legal strategy. It was the expression of a man who has just seen something he wasn't expecting from a person he thought he knew completely. This changes your exposure significantly, Marcus said carefully. I know. This is not a small addition to an already complex case. This is... I know what it is, Marcus. Damien's voice was quiet. Not hard. Not managed. Just quiet. The way things get quiet when the management has been removed and what's left is the actual substance of a thing. I'm not asking you to protect it. I'm telling you so that you know, going into this afternoon, what the full picture is. All of it. Not the version I've been showing you. Marcus picked up his pen. He held it without writing anything. He looked at Damien for a long moment, with the careful attention of a man taking a last measurement of something before it changes. All right, he said finally. All right. Drake came back in at the 15-minute mark exactly, which Damien respected despite everything. Precision was a form of honesty. She sat down, reopened the folder, and looked at him with the same focused attention she'd brought into the room the first time, except now there was something additional in it, a quality of having received new information and integrated it without letting it show as surprise. Mr. Cross, she said, before we continue, I want to ask you about a series of transactions from 2021, specifically transfers routed through a subaccount under the Cross Capital operational umbrella, authorized under Raymond Chu's signature authority. Damien looked at her. He felt Marcus go still beside him, not moving, not speaking, waiting. I can speak to those, Damien said. Drake looked at him. Just for a moment, something shifted in her expression, infinitesimally, barely enough to register, the adjustment of a person who is expecting one thing and has just been offered another. Go ahead, she said. He talked for 40 minutes. He talked about the subaccount, the transfer routing, the way he had structured the signature authorization so that Raymond's existing authority was applied without Raymond's knowledge or consent. He talked about the offshore structures, not in the defensive language of a man explaining his way around something, but in the factual language of a man describing what he built and why and what he understood, at the time, about what he was doing. Marcus intervened twice with legal qualifications. Damien let him intervene and then continued. Drake asked questions. Precise, well-constructed questions that made clear her team had already assembled most of this picture and was now checking his account against their own. He answered each one directly. When he didn't know the precise detail, he said so. When the answer was uncomfortable, he gave it anyway. At the end of the 40 minutes, Drake closed the folder. Mr. Cross, she said, I want to be direct with you. The voluntary disclosure you've just made regarding the Chu account transactions is a significant factor in how this investigation proceeds. It does not eliminate your exposure. It changes the shape of it. She paused. We'll need a full written account of today's disclosure by end of week. Your attorney will receive the formal documentation of cooperation protocols. She paused again. Do you have anything else you want to put on record today? He thought about it. He actually thought about it. Not as a strategic calculation, but as a genuine inventory. Is there anything else, any remaining corner where something is hidden, any other person carrying weight that belongs to me? No, he said. That's everything. She nodded. We'll recess for today. Don't leave the city. He and Marcus walked out through the hallway toward the elevator, and that was where he saw her. She was coming out of a door 20 feet down the corridor, her attorney beside her, a federal liaison he didn't recognize on her other side. She was still in the camel coat. Her leather folder was under her arm. She had the composed, slightly drawn look of someone who has been answering questions for an extended period and is managing the residual cost of sustained precision. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. They were 20 feet apart in a government hallway with 4 attorneys and 2 federal agents distributed between them and no version of this moment that any of the surrounding professionals would sanction. They were 20 feet apart, and the distance was not a physical measurement. It was 7 years, and a kitchen light, and a wedding ring on an empty mattress, and a gray sweater at 3 in the morning, and a child neither of them had yet spoken about in the same room at the same time. Isla's attorney touched her arm, said something low. Isla didn't move. She looked at Damien across the hallway with the expression he had seen on the sidewalk that morning. That recognition, that preparedness. But there was something else in it now, something that hadn't been there on the sidewalk. Something that his 40 minutes of disclosure in that conference room might have produced in the air of this building and found its way to her somehow, the way things do in spaces where truth has recently been spoken. She was looking at him like she was seeing him, not the version of him she had lived with, not the version he had constructed for consumption. The actual underneath of him, the thing that was left when the performance was removed, and what remained was just a man who had built everything wrong and was now standing in the rubble of it, trying to figure out whether the rubble could be the beginning of something or was only the end. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her attorney moved again, gently, and this time she let herself be moved, and she turned and walked toward the elevator at the far end of the corridor, and Damien watched her go, and Marcus touched his elbow, and they went in the opposite direction, and that was the last time they were in the same room for a very long time. The months that followed were not redemptive in any clean sense of the word. They were not the months of a man who made a decision and transformed. They were the months of a man who made a series of smaller decisions, each one slightly better than the one before it, and lived with the accumulating consequence of that incremental change without any guarantee it was adding up to anything worth having. The federal case resolved over 8 months. Damien pled to reduce charges, 2 counts of financial fraud, conspiracy to commit tax evasion, in exchange for full cooperation on the broader investigation into offshore financial structures that extended well beyond cross-capital. The cooperation was real, and it was comprehensive, and it was the most uncomfortable, sustained experience of his adult life, sitting in room after room and answering question after question and watching the architecture of everything he'd built get disassembled piece by people whose job was to understand exactly how it had worked. Raymond Chu's name was cleared of the forged authorization. The disclosure Damien had made in the conference room that afternoon, the thing he had said to Marcus an hour before he said it to Drake, in the quiet of a room where 4 people's lives were reorienting around new information. That disclosure protected Raymond from charges he would not have survived professionally or personally. Raymond called him once, 6 months later, when the case had largely resolved. The call was brief. Raymond said thank you. Damien said he was sorry it had taken him this long to say the thing that needed saying. Raymond said, yeah. And there was a silence, and then they both hung up. And that was the end of 8 years of professional relationship, and it was the most honest exchange they had ever had. Cross Capital was restructured under new leadership. Harlan Voss, in a move that Damien had not anticipated and could not have predicted, did not pursue full liquidation. He rebuilt around the firm's legitimate holdings, which were substantial, and brought in a COO who was known in financial circles for ethical practice. The firm survived, smaller and quieter, and without Damien's name on the letterhead. He learned this from Marcus, who learned it from a mutual contact, and when Marcus told him, Damien's response was to sit with it for a moment and feel. Not pride, not anger, but something like relief that the thing he had built had not been entirely destroyed by what he had done to it. His sentencing came in March. 18 months, federal facility with eligibility for early release contingent on continued cooperation. The morning he was sentenced, he stood in the courtroom and heard the judge read the terms and felt, in the precise moment the gavel came down, something he had not felt since the night he stood in the empty apartment with Isla's note in his hand. Not the helplessness of that night. Something different. The specific, strange, uncomfortable sensation of a man who has stopped running from something and is now simply standing in it. Not peace, not acceptance, just presence. The willingness to be exactly where he was without constructing an alternative. He served 11 months. He read. He slept 8 hours a night for the first time in a decade. He wrote a letter to Isla that he didn't send. He wrote a second one that he also didn't send. He wrote a third one that was 3 sentences long and said, "I am not asking for anything. I want you to know that I understand now what I did and didn't do. I am sorry that it took losing everything for me to become someone capable of that understanding." He gave the letter to Marcus and asked him to use his judgment about whether to pass it along. Marcus passed it along. He never received a response. The baby was born in April. A girl, 7 pounds 4 ounces, in a hospital on the Upper West Side where Gavin Mercer sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. And Isla's attorney and 2 close friends were there in the delivery room, and the world outside continued its indifferent rotation. He learned all of this from Marcus, who learned it from Isla's attorney in the context of custody pre-filings, which were proceeding through the family court system on a separate track from the criminal case, with the specific patience of a legal process that is not in a hurry because it doesn't need to be. Her name was Clara. He sat with that name in the institutional quiet of his facility and turned it over in his mind and found that it was a name Isla would have chosen. Clear, simple, not trying to be anything other than what it was. He requested, through proper legal channels, to be notified of the birth. He was notified. He was not present. He did not request to be present. The boundaries of what he was and was not entitled to had been clarified in extensive legal documentation, and he had signed each piece of that documentation without contest, because contesting it would have been the action of a man who was still trying to win something, and he was trying, imperfectly, inconsistently, some days better than others, to become a man who understood the difference between what he was entitled to claim and what he had actually earned. He was released in February. Gray morning, federal facility parking lot, Marcus waiting with a car that wasn't a town car for the first time in their professional relationship. Just a regular sedan, warm inside, with coffee in the cup holder. Damien got in. He didn't say anything for a few minutes. Manhattan was an hour away and the highway opened up ahead of them, and the winter fields on either side were flat and still and pale with cold. "She set up a meeting," Marcus said, after the silence had run its natural course. Damien looked at him. "Isla, her attorney contacted mine last week. She wants to discuss a parenting framework, not custody. That's still in the court process. A framework. What contact looks like going forward, how decisions get made, what she needs to feel confident about before any of it begins." Marcus paused. "She's not required to do this. She could have let the court handle everything and never been in the same room with you voluntarily again." "I know," Damien said. "She wants to do it in person, with both attorneys present and a mediator." "When?" "She suggested next month. Enough time for you to settle." Damien looked out the window at the winter fields. A farmhouse sat back from the highway, lights on in the kitchen window even at this hour of the morning. He looked at that lit window for as long as it stayed in view, which wasn't long, and then it was gone behind them, and the highway continued. "Tell her attorney yes," he said. The meeting was in a conference room in a building in Midtown that belonged to neither of their attorneys, a neutral space arranged by the mediator, a woman in her 60s named Dr. Adayeze Okonkwo, who had the specific gravity of someone who has spent decades in rooms where people are trying to find the last remaining ground they share. The room was not unlike the federal conference room from 7 months before. Clean, institutional, carrying no one's history. Ela came in with her attorney and sat across the table from Damien and his attorney, and Dr. Okonkwo sat at the head between them, and for a moment after everyone was seated, nobody said anything. She looked different, not dramatically. She was Ela, the same proportions, the same face he had looked at for 7 years without fully registering, but there was something about the quality of how she occupied the chair that had changed. She sat in it fully, not taking up more space than before, not asserting herself in any visible way, but occupying the space she was in without any of the contracted quality he hadn't noticed until it was gone. She had been making herself smaller for 7 years, and he had never once noticed because the smallness had been useful to him. She was not small now. She had Clara with a sitter. He knew this because Marcus had coordinated logistics with her attorney, and the fact of the sitter's existence had come through the coordination. He knew, from the same channel, that Clara had dark hair and was 3 months old and had recently begun sleeping through the night, which Isla had mentioned to her attorney in passing and which her attorney had mentioned to Marcus without particular calculation, just the ambient information that surrounds a new life. Dr. Okonkwo opened the meeting with a brief description of the format and the ground rules. Both attorneys acknowledged. Damien looked at Isla, and she was looking at her folder, and then she looked up, and they were looking at each other across a table that was, in its dimensions, not very wide at all. "I want to say something before we begin," Damien said. Dr. Okonkwo looked at him. Isla looked at him. His attorney's hand moved slightly toward his arm and then stopped. "Not about the framework, not about Clara." He paused. "About you, about what I did and didn't do. For 7 years." He paused again because the words needed space, because saying them without space would have made them sound managed, and he was trying very hard not to manage this. "I took what you were and decided it was less than what I needed. I looked at your patience and called it passivity. I looked at your love and called it availability." He stopped. His hands were flat on the table. "I don't know how to make that right. I don't think it can be made right. But I needed to say it directly to you, in a room, out loud, so that you know that I know what I did. Not because it changes anything, just because you're owed the truth of it." The room was quiet. Isla looked at him for a long time. Her expression did not soften, exactly. It wasn't that kind of moment, and she wasn't that kind of woman, and softening would have been a gesture toward reconciliation that neither of them was in a position to mean, but something in her posture changed by a very small degree, the adjustment of a person who has received something they expected to have to fight harder to get, and is recalibrating in response. "I know you know," she said. Her voice was even. "I've known for a while that you know." She paused. "That's actually why I agreed to this meeting instead of letting the attorneys do all of it." He waited. "Clara is going to grow up," Isla said. "She's going to ask questions about her father. Not about the case, not about the money, not about any of it. She's going to ask the basic question that every child asks, which is, who is he? And I'm not going to answer that question for her by telling her who you were for 7 years." She paused. "I'm going to let her find out who you are now, over time, carefully, with every protection in place and every boundary held and not 1 inch of ground that hasn't been earned." Her voice didn't waver. "But I'm not going to take that away from her before she's had the chance to form her own understanding. The weight of what she had just given him, not forgiveness, not restoration, not anything that erased what had happened, but the specific, costly gift of a future that had not yet been foreclosed, landed on him with a quiet enormity that he did not try to manage or contain. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said, and there was something almost sharp in it, not cruel, just honest. "Do the work. That's the only thing that matters now." Dr. Okonkwo said gently, "Shall we begin?" They began. The parenting framework took 3 sessions to negotiate and 4 months to ratify. Every detail was contested with care and patience, and the specific attention that people give to things that matter enormously. Supervised visits, beginning at monthly intervals, in a neutral location, with review periods built in at 6 months and 12 months. Communication protocols, decision-making structures for medical and educational matters. Documentation requirements. Everything in writing. Everything accountable. Damien signed it in his attorney's office on a Thursday morning in June, 18 months after the night he had come home to an empty apartment and a wedding ring on a bare mattress. He signed it with a pen Marcus handed him, and he read every line before he signed because he had agreed to be a man who reads the things he is authorizing, and when the last page was signed, he put the pen down and sat back and breathed. Outside the window, Manhattan was fully summer. The trees lining the block were dense and green, and the light was the particular gold of early afternoon, generous and slow, the kind of light that makes the city look like it might actually be livable. He had a sublet on the east side, a small apartment, 2 rooms, nothing like the penthouse, with a view of a brick wall and a fire escape and a neighbor who played music he didn't recognize at moderate volume through the wall at 9 in the evening. He had begun running in the mornings. He had begun cooking, badly and with concentration, from a cookbook he had found in a box of books someone had left in the building lobby for anyone to take. He had taken it because he was a person who was trying to do things differently, and taking a stranger's discarded cookbook felt like the kind of small, uncalculated choice that people who do things differently make. He saw Clara for the first time on a Saturday in July. She was 3 months past 4 months old, and she had dark hair and very serious eyes, and she looked at him from the arms of the mediator-approved facilitator in the neutral room they had agreed upon with the expression of a person conducting an assessment. He sat across from her in a chair that was smaller than any chair he had occupied in his professional life, And he looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything because only one of them was capable of saying anything, and he didn't trust himself to choose the right first words. She reached out one hand in his general direction, not toward him specifically, just outward, the way small children reach, testing the proposition that the world beyond their immediate position might contain something of interest. He extended one finger. She grabbed it with a grip that was surprisingly strong and entirely without agenda, and held it, and looked at him with those serious eyes, and he sat in that chair in that neutral room and felt something move through him that was not like any feeling he had a name for from his previous life. Something that didn't have the shape of power or strategy or control or even love as he had previously understood it. Something simpler and harder to hold, and not at all something he deserved, and entirely something he intended to be worthy of. One day, one careful incremental day at a time. Isla was not in the room. She was in the adjacent waiting area with her attorney and a cup of coffee, giving him this hour with the specific and costly generosity of a woman who has decided, against significant evidence, to leave one door open to the future. Not for him, not for the idea of reconciliation, but for the small person in the facilitator's arms who would grow up and form her own opinions and deserved, as her mother had said, the chance to find out who he was now. The hour ended. The facilitator signaled gently. Damien released Clara's hand. She had held his finger for most of the hour, intermittently, between bouts of looking at other things and discovering her own hands, and doing the various activities of a person who is new to the world and finds everything in it worth examining. He stood up and straightened his jacket and thanked the facilitator and walked to the door. He stopped. He turned back and looked at Clara one more time. She was looking at the window. The summer light was coming through it in a way that was apparently interesting to her, catching dust particles that drifted in the still air of the room, and she tracked them with the serious, focused attention of someone who has just discovered that light moves and has decided this is the most significant information she has yet encountered. He looked at her for a moment. Just that. Just looking, the way he had so rarely looked at anything in his life without deciding what it was worth to him. Then he opened the door and walked out, and in the waiting area Isla was standing. She had stood when she heard the door, an instinct, an old readiness, and they were 5 feet apart in a hallway that was not the federal building hallway, and not the sidewalk outside the DA's office, and not the lobby of a building that no longer belonged to him, just a hallway in a mediator's office in Midtown Manhattan on a Saturday afternoon in July, with the city going about its business outside, and Clara in the next room discovering the properties of light. Isla looked at him. "She held my hand," he said. It came out with nothing around it, no context, no framing, just the fact of it. Something moved across Isla's face, very briefly, the kind of movement that could not have been planned because no one plans the specific involuntary response of a mother hearing something small and good about her child. "She does that," Isla said. "She does it with everyone." "I know," he said. "I know it wasn't for me specifically." He paused. It was still... He stopped. He didn't have the word. He had spent 20 years in rooms full of words, and he didn't have the word for what it was. "It mattered," he said finally. Isla looked at him for one more moment. Then she nodded, once, the nod of a woman who has received something without owing a response to it, and turned and went to the door of the room where her daughter was, and went inside. The door closed. Damien stood in the hallway for a moment, then walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited. And when the doors opened, he stepped in and faced forward and watched the doors close on the hallway. He rode down alone. Outside, the city was exactly what it always was. Enormous, indifferent, continuous, asking nothing of anyone and offering everything to those willing to look at it without demanding it be something other than what it was. He stood on the sidewalk in the July heat and did not take out his phone and did not flag a cab and did not move toward anything for approximately 30 seconds, which was longer than he had stood still in the open air without a purpose since he was a child. Then he started walking. Not toward anything specific, just walking. The way the city allows you to walk when you finally stop trying to own it. One block and then another, through the noise and the heat and the particular smell of a New York summer afternoon, past the delis and the construction and the people sitting on stoops and the kids on bikes and the old men outside the social clubs and all the unmapped, uncatalogued, unmonetized life of a city that has always been too large and too various and too stubbornly itself to be controlled by any one person's idea of what it should be. He had lost a great deal. He would spend years accounting for what he had lost and who he had been and what the cost of both had been to people who had done nothing to earn the burden of his choices. That accounting was not finished and would not be finished soon, and there was no version of it that ended with everything restored. Because some things, once taken, are not given back in the same form, and the only honest relationship to have with that truth is to know it and keep moving anyway. He kept moving. The city received him the way it receives everyone, without ceremony, without judgment, without any record of what came before. Just the next block, and the one after that, and the particular gold of the afternoon light laying itself across the buildings and the street and the faces of strangers, warming everything it touched without asking whether any of it deserved to be warm. He walked until the light changed. Then he kept walking.